Here we go. It's time. Streams. Get up. I really do have to start focusing myself out. Take one. It is cold. It is windy. I'm in. Blake. Hello. And welcome to the Trebuchet podcast. This is episode 7. We are back after a few day break. And before we get started, I want to anytime I have a coffee mug, I just want to shout them out. This is Walking with Purpose. This is a women's group that I joined with my best friend, Belle. And we had a women's group in Pacific Grove. This isn't really part of the DOD whistleblowing. At some point, I'll just tell this story like on a private channel. And I think I'll probably interview somebody about it on my podcast, Golden Otter Divinations, because it's more like of a spiritual warfare type situation. But my DOD service member, right before we separated, tried to arrange an exorcism for me. Not a joke, real story. Wish it was a joke, not. Because I had converted to Catholicism for him to be what I hoped was like the final step in my transformation from just shitty old Alaskan trash bird, University of Oregon rugby player, to perfect military spouse. And as I say all that as a segue to, it was actually my conversion to Catholicism that saved my life, along with all the incredible women who stood up for me and men, but especially women in those early days who were like, Autumn, you can't live like this. It's not right. This is not normal. Yes, a lot of these things that you're experiencing in your marriage are part of military life, but it's not the okay parts, and it's okay to not be okay with it. So a couple things. One, I was at the lawyer's all day today, so I just got home, threw this on, climbed on up here, grabbed my bone broth and my Walking with Purpose mug, because every Wednesday night for a year I went to a women's Bible study at our church in Pacific Grove, and it was life-saving, it was life-sustaining. And several times after civilian court, I was in a really, really dark place because I just kept getting beaten down and swallowed alive by the family courts who tend to rule for patriarchy and stability, especially in military towns. And it was the women in this group who saved my life and prayed with me and prayed over me. And so before I get going, if you or a loved one are suffering from domestic violence, please check out our resources below. I've been working with production a lot lately to streamline these episodes because it's a lot. You know, I'm going through a very personal journey, and I'm also trying to find the ways to share this information in a responsible manner, and also realizing that like a lot of the people I'm dining out in the military and the Department of State are like actual trained killers. Like, I know that sounds so naive, but a lot of these men and women have been to war. And I was telling a member of production the other night a story about somebody, and they're like, didn't you say that person's name on air? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, aren't you concerned maybe they could hurt you? And I was like, yeah, you know what? Now that I think about it, shit, yeah, they are special forces. You know what? Let's beep that one out and put it behind a paywall. So what I'm getting at with that is we're going to try really hard in these remaining episodes of season 1 to share a story, point out the problem, point out the solution, and then give you a tool. And as always, we're going to have links down here. And this is my space where I share about my journey as a DOD whistleblower. And technically, I am also a DOS, Department of State whistleblower, because I was employed by the State Department. I think we're not really quite sure whether or not I was a federal employee when I blew the whistle or not, because I did still have an active clearance. But either way, like, I used to hold a clearance based on my credentials. And when I first started uncovering a lot of this nonsense, I was a credential holder. So whether we're on technicalities or not. But please check out those links, and then like and subscribe. And then for those of you who have noticed, I'm sure by now, some of you have been to my other podcast, Golden Otter Divinations, where the metaphysical meets the mainstream. And the Trebuchet podcast is where the military meets the mainstream, but Golden Otter is where the metaphysical meets the mainstream. And some of you may notice I look completely different. Yes, it is me. No, she didn't eat me. Just kidding. I made that joke the other day, and that's not very sweet. So like, you look, what's going on here? And I was just like, that was just my old body. And they're like, well, how do you feel in this new body? And I was like, honestly, I really loved my old body. Like, I loved it. I thought it was really pretty. I thought I was like, my hair was long. I was voluptuous, yes. But I just, that body gave birth to 3 beautiful babies. And so I would never shame it and never dismiss it or anything like that. And this body is the result of trying to be the perfect wife and the perfect army wife, the picture perfect, right? So that's what the story is going to be about today. It's going to be about why families choose to live in on-base housing. And then we're going to talk about our personal journey of why we chose on-base housing over time, what ended up happening in on-base housing, and then talk about some solutions and offer tools. So when I first got married, we were 21. And somebody had given the advice of buying a home at your very first duty station. Genius advice, so we actually did it. We bought a condo in Hawaii at Schofield Barracks, and in 2008, right before he deployed, and I managed that. I learned everything I possibly could about finances. And this is my pro tip for military spouses. Oh, sorry, pause. I forgot a little legal disclaimer, in case anybody forgot. This is a podcast about Bigfoot. Remember that at all costs. This podcast is about finding Bigfoot. Any stories I tell, any likenesses that I share, just happen to be coincidence. And for legal purposes, this is a podcast about finding Bigfoot. And so every episode, I'm just gonna have to try to find him. Okay, I joke, but also you guys would not believe the threats that we have received. And you're making a difference when people want to shut you up and you have to actually consult lawyers and really dial in on stuff. So that is both a legal disclaimer and a joke, but not a joke. Okay. So back in 2008, we bought a house in Mililani, Hawaii, and I researched home loans while he was deployed. I refinanced it. I did interest rates. We used the VA loan. And a lot of families do this, and it's very, very smart. And it's a good way to go into home ownership, and then you rent that property out over time and make, money. As long as you can get like a good property manager or somebody to, take care of it for you when you deploy. Or you just you flip and sell, whatever. There's a lot of cottage industries for military spouses and military members to make money because, as we all know, we're on a fixed income in the military. If you're an E1 and you start an E1, you know what your pay scale is going to be until you get to E9, E10. If you're if you go OCS, which is officer, OCS is green to gold, NCO. If you become a non-commissioned officer, you go to OCS. You know what your pay scale is, and if you're an officer, you know what your pay scale is. So it's a fixed income. And so that was something that my spouse and I always ran into, was he wanted me to be this traditional wife where, I went to college and then I wanted to be a lawyer, but we ended up teaching. And then once we started having kids, and so up until when we started having kids, we always lived off base. The only time we ever lived on base was in 2011. And this is, honestly, I'm starting to see some patterns. The only times we really ran into problems in our marriage, that's real interesting little connection I just made, was when we lived on base. So in 2011, my service member was investigated for sexual assault against a minor. That is a story I'll share later. And we're going to be releasing that information and the actual files that we find on it in the Trebuchet files. So click around, find the link for that. We have decided to put all of those documents behind a paywall. Sorry, but it's the only way to really stay safe as I start to disclose this. Because of course, once it's out, it's going to be out and it's going to be everywhere. And I do kind of hope that a journalist gets it and puts it wherever it needs to be. But with that said, just for safety and tracking and all that, we're going to put it behind a paywall. So find them on the Trebuchet files. Okay. So Fort Benning. It's the first time we lived in on-base housing. And it was actually kind of nice. We'd always lived off base so that we could save money because, as I discussed in previous episodes for civilians out there, when you're married, you get paid a dependent rate. So you get paid for having dependents. They literally call us dependents, like it's in the name. And so that's why the Trebuchet podcast is breaking the toxic dependency cycle of the military-industrial complex. So the military-industrial complex is a term, as I've explained before, that President Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, coined at the end of his farewell speech to Congress at the end of his term. So in case anybody's not familiar with President Eisenhower and why we'll always shout him out, he was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in World War II and was responsible for bringing World War II to a resolution and laying out a course so that we did not have a World War III. At least we haven't for, 70-something years now. So he was a badass. And he ironically was an officer that never actually served in the battlefield, but he was very good at project management, let's just say, like really good at like piecemealing things and seeing how everything kind of fit together from a bird's eye view. And there have been so many times in my journey of like unpacking the military industrial complex where I've like thought of him and I'm like, I'm fighting so many battles on so many fronts. What the actual fuck? And then I go back and look at World War II history. And I'm like, damn, like it's no different than World War II. We're fighting multiple battles on multiple fronts. And part of the reason why we're putting the Trebuchet podcast, the Trebuchet files behind a paywall is I've got $200,000 in lawyer's fees I have to pay. I wasn't just getting divorced from a man. I was divorcing an institution, and I got penalized for trying to leave that institution and reveal what was happening within it. So, like, fighting the DOD is not cheap. Anyways, living on base. When you are a dependent, and you're young in your marriage, it might be easier to live off base. And, you could work a job, and your spouse, your soldier is going to work, and it's kind of a nice little life. And that's how it was when we lived in Hawaii, at Schofield Barracks, and when we were in... and then I guess we went to Fort Benning, but we were only in on-base housing for like 6 months while he was in the career course. And that was just like a matter of convenience. And then he went to Ranger School. I PCS'd ahead and I lived off base because I was teaching at Fort Liberty now. And then at our next duty station, Tennessee, also lived off base and then had a baby, lived off base when we were in Monterey. The first time at the Presidio in 2014, lived off base when we were in South America. And then we first started living on base when we moved to Washington, D.C. And we moved into JBAB. So JBAB is Joint Base Bowling Anacostia, and it is a joint Navy Air Force base. So Navy and Air Force is a little bit better, but we did notice some issues with the on-base housing. Like the prices were kind of sketch, and they would like take more BAH, basic housing allowance, if you got a promotion, but you had to stay in the same house. They weren't following tenant laws, and they weren't like replacing carpets like when they were supposed to. And my daughter Everly, the middle daughter, she got really sick when she was a baby and was getting these like horrible skin rashes on her neck and chest. And this is when I first had to start advocating for my kids against a system. I had to advocate for my oldest daughter against TRICARE for something, which I was like, that's really your guidance? Like, that goes against my mother's intuition. And so I didn't follow that, but I never really messed too much with TRICARE. My mom's an internist, and so I always just kind of like followed my own path with TRICARE, but I know that a lot of people struggle with TRICARE, and we will do a TRICARE deep dive on like season 3. We will go into like the TRICARE corruption and cover up and blah, 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 blah. Which, if you're an actuary for TRICARE, I would love, or if you're an investigative reporter, I would love to hear the connection between domestic violence and TRICARE payouts, because this has to be costing the government a ton of money. The on-base military housing that's making families sick in mass and the domestic violence that's going on, there has to be an actuary that works for USAA, which an actuary is a person who like calculates how much something is going to cost an insurance company and like what the liability of it is. So it's like, if you're a white male between the ages of 38 to 42, and you've served 17 years in the military, what are the chances you're going to be a perpetrator of domestic violence and cost the military hundreds of thousands in medical bills? Would love to see the stats on that. Just saying, if you're an actuary, DM me. Maybe I can get ChatGPT to figure that out. Okay. The only reason I bring that up is I was hit by a drunk driver about a month ago, which is how I ended up in the RV. And again, I'll tell that story another time. But it was like a series of unfortunate and fortunate events. And when I was talking to the insurance providers, USA, they were like, so what's going on? And they needed information. I said, well, actually, I'm a victim of domestic violence. I don't, reside with my service member anymore. We're going through a divorce. And he goes, you know what? You're like the 5th woman just this month I have talked to who's a victim of domestic violence. And he goes, and I just do automobile claims. Really seems like I'm noticing it in increasing amounts lately. And it was like literally a throwaway comment that an insurance adjuster for the automobile policy made to me. And for anybody who's not familiar, USAA is the number one homeowners policy, number one, who does homeowners for policies, like renters insurance and homeowners insurance. And again, because this whole topic is about on-base military housing, I'm giving that information so that you guys can start to look into this because it's going to be part of the tool. Like, for example, did you know that if you were harmed in your on-base house, your insurance policy is actually something that you can recover against? That's a little workaround that the housing companies sometimes try to hide behind. And it's like, oh, well, if you were hurt in your house, then use your insurance policy. And then they will get you to take the hit on your deductible, meaning the copay or the amount that you pay, and they get off scot-free because they know that we're military and we all have to have insurance. So again, I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of how the Trebuchet all got started and went down, and it started with toxic housing at the Presidio of Monterey. But it really goes back because in order to understand how and why I got so pissed about the just blatant corruption and the way that the government and these privatized housing companies were looking the other way is we always lived off base, and mold and unhappy, on base military families was never really our problem because we were foreign area officers stationed overseas, and I was busy being in Argentina buying fabulous jackets like this. Okay, I wasn't really, but I did get this in Argentina, but that's a whole other story. Anyways, where was I? Housing. So choosing to live in on-base housing is a choice that a lot of military families start to make once they start having kids, because then you only get the BAH increase for being a dependent rate once. So it's either married and with a dependent rate and it's a higher pay, or not married. And then if you're not married, based on certain ranks, you have to live in the barracks. And then after certain ranks, you can live off post. But again, you don't get paid anymore. So a lot of those guys will get roommates or whatever. So if you're not going to go the home ownership route, or maybe you bought a home like we did in Hawaii in 2008, it just doesn't really make sense not to live on base if you've got kids, because there's, amazing communities and, I'll read the benefits, right? So this is a comment that somebody made about living in on-base housing. So when I first moved into on-base housing, I thought we'd finally found some stability, a tight-knit community, fenced-in yards, and the supposed safety that came with being behind the gate. It was supposed to be a relief. Commissaries close, CDCs are close, not having to search, child development centers, not having to search for rentals or deal with landlords who didn't understand our military lifestyle. But within weeks, the ceiling started leaking, the black spots on the walls, mold. The HVAC barely worked, and when my daughter started getting sick, I knew something was wrong. I submitted maintenance tickets, I called, I pleaded, and I waited when my child's health got worse. What was supposed to be a refuge for military families like mine had become a threat to our health and safety. I did not write this, but that is literally what happened to us on JBAB, on Joint Base Bowling Anacostia in 2016 when my middle daughter was born. So we didn't have mold issues in that house, but we did have a lot of health problems. And we chalked it up to being in DC and the water not being that great. And if you go and look at old photos of me and old videos, like I don't look well, like, and neither does my ex, to be honest. Like we look unwell. My daughters look unwell. Like they don't look healthy. And my daughter Everly was getting these horrible rashes when she was learning to crawl. And so I had been advocating because we knew we were going to be in that on-base house for like 4 years because my service member was in the foreign area officer training pipeline. So he was going to, where did he start? He went to Georgetown, got his degree in security studies. And then he went to the majors course down at Fort Belvoir. So we got to stay because it's only like a 30-minute drive at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and JBAB is Washington, D.C. And then he went to an assignment at DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. And so it was 3 assignments back to back to back, which is why we got to stay in D.C. for 3.5 years. And it's when I started working on Fort McNair at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. And we decided to live on base because our oldest daughter was in middle school, or was in preschool. And I went and looked at 17 schools in the area because they didn't have an on-base school, but they bused to schools. And they had like this lottery program with the military where you would get a preference once they get into kindergarten. And so we thought we would be there longer for whatever reasons. And I played the lottery and ended up getting her into a bilingual school. And then I just drove her in and out every day. But that's one of the reasons why a lot of families end up living on base is because then it's like a school community where the officers' kids sometimes go to school together if there's multiple elementary or schools on the base. Or the enlisted kids go to school together, or if it's just a smaller base, everybody goes to school together. But they're all military, and so there's a similar culture, right? Because it's a very unique culture to move as much as we do. And so for us, when we moved into on-base housing at JBAB, I had to start advocating for my daughter Everly because I was realizing like that the housing company did not do what they were supposed to do, which was like really simple stuff, like change out the blinds in our house because some of them still had strings, like pull cords, and then the carpet. And so for me, I really started to get stressed when we had a friend come over, a neighbor, and they had 3 beautiful little girls, and the service member had actually had 2 older daughters. And he talked a lot about one daughter in the past tense and then the other one being with his ex-wife. And I'd never known what had happened to this other daughter. And after knowing them for about a year and going to church with them for about a year, maybe 2, I guess it was about a year because this was in the summer. Yeah, so about a year. And this is as Everly was getting really, really sick and like starting to crawl and be about a year old. He had told me, I'd been saying I'd been having problems with the housing company. And he said, you really need to stay on them because if, they'll never do anything if you don't. And he actually, oh God, this is a hard story. He actually, oh God. He actually told me about his oldest daughter who was killed in on-base housing while they were in the home in another room. The 2 little girls were playing, and the pull cord from the... Sorry, this is like actually I haven't told the story. There's no reason to ever tell the story. It's so tragic and it's so heartbreaking. The pull cord in the curtains got wrapped around her neck and she asphyxiated in the home while the parents were just in the other room. And the other sister came out and said, she's asleep, come get her. They found her and she had exsanguinated. I'm not going to tell that family's branch of service. This was a multi-service duty station that we lived at, but it was on a military installation and on-base housing that happened. And as a result, there were, laws passed and regulations passed to ensure that type of tragedy never happened again. And while we lived in on-base housing at JBAB, They did come in and do some general upgrades that were needed, like put registers on our second floor windows that were just able just to totally open. So you could have a toddler that just opened a window all the way out and fell out of a second floor room. And the reason why it's really important to hold these housing providers accountable is that the military is a very specific subgroup of American culture. Predominantly reproductive bearing age, so between 18 and 45 is kind of the general bulk age range. You don't get many guys over 45 unless they're senior officers or senior NCOs or senior enlisted guys. And so the bulk of the population of military families is reproductive age, which means that the bulk of these houses are going to be housing families. Whereas in a traditional neighborhood, you would have a mix of, a multi-generational family or an elderly family or a high-rise or a, mixed unit, like a triplex or a duplex or an apartment complex. And so having neighborhoods that are predominantly like socioeconomically the same, and they all make the exact same amount of money, you know exactly what your utilities are going to be, you know exactly what they're going to pay you, makes them easy prey. And because they move so frequently and there's not very many squeaky wheels, because by the time you become a squeaky wheel, it's already time to go. And so, this quote, I submitted maintenance tickets, I called, I pleaded, and I waited. But my children's health got worse. So at the very beginning of this podcast, I discussed one of the senior leaders who ended up having me banned from base after offering me a job to work in the housing department at said base. And he said to me God, what a fucking arrogant prick. Sorry. Sometimes I just remember the shit that these men did and said. And I'm just like, you are so gross. Like, so gross and so arrogant, and just, who do you think you are? Like, you're a colonel, so fucking what? Now you're a colonel who's going to be infamous because I've dined you out for just being a trash bag when you could have done the right thing. And speaking of President Eisenhower, I remember this colonel being in my bedroom, looking at the black mold in my bathroom that kept coming back. And he was like, "Oh, Eisenhower, huh?" And he tried to one-up me. And he was like, "Do you know what his wife's name was?" And I was like, "Mimi." And he was like, "Oh, yeah." Like, he just you know what I mean when men try to mansplain? And there's got to be a thing called colonel-splaining. Like, you colonel, you know what? The only colonel I like is Colonel Burgess and maybe Colonel Collins. The rest of you, trash birds. They call you birds, full birds, trash birds. Sorry. Really try not to be a bitter Betty, but do better and stop. You're not God's gift. Literally do better. And if you're a lieutenant colonel and I'm talking trash on you, can you step up and do the right thing and get your boys in check? Because it's just enough. Anyways, I digress. Said colonel says to me, "Mrs. Seibel, is this on-base housing situation really that bad?" As we had black mold literally coming through our ceiling that I had been calling for over a year about, while my son and I were getting increasingly sick and eventually both diagnosed with building-induced illness and had to be moved out of said house, which I think was for over a year not rented out. And our neighbor's house, they ended up tearing down all the walls because they had 5 kids and they ended up getting really sick. And I'll release all these videos. A lot of them are are here on the YouTube channel. You can go check them out. I started documenting the rodent infestation after talking to private lawyers, and they were like, "You got to start documenting this stuff," because they checked into it, and the government was just fully complicit in not holding these private military companies accountable. So, anyways, he goes, "Mrs. Seibel, does this keep you up at night?" And I had just made a YouTube video of my work orders, which again, you can check out down here. And I looked at him and I said, "Colonel, scruffily legs," Colonel Jackass, "Yes, sir, it does keep me up at night. I'm worried that if this is happening in my house and I'm married to a lieutenant colonel, who else's home is this happening to? We're officers, and if it's happening to us, it's happening to enlisted families." And I just had a little bit of a run-in with an enlisted spouse who was really struggling with her housing and just really pissy about it. And now I'm looking back, I'm gosh, no wonder she was so upset. Nobody was coming to help her. Nobody was coming to help. And again, as I've said before on this podcast, things never seem to change until they happen to an officer's wife. And then there's enough attention on it. Somebody's going, okay, well, she made it to Lieutenant Colonel's wife somehow. And she put in her years, so maybe she knows a thing or two. And I do. I know where the bodies are buried. So grab your shovels. Let's go. Speaking of, we're going to pause it for a second because we did not get to the part where we're giving a tool or we are doing any of that. So I'm going to clap it out. We're going to pin this for episode 7. And then we're going to come back for episode 8. I'm going to keep going on the toxic military housing. But before I go, in case this is the only episode that you get to watch, here's your tool. Document. Get out your video cameras. When you are on your on-base housing and somebody is in a public space within your home that is your domicile, you have every right to prevent them from entry unless they give you proper written notification that they're coming in to inspect. Make sure that you check with your state laws. Yes, they're going to cite a ground lease, but you still are protected by state laws. So get ChatGPT going, check what your tenant laws are in whatever state you are based in. That's number 1. Check your tenant laws, print out a copy, and have that with you. 2, document everything. If you put in a work order, take a screenshot of it and save it in a file on your phone or on your computer. That is literally the only way that I was able to catch these MFers editing their work orders to show work that was never done, or to like they change things around. And I'm like, what is happening here? Why is this all? And I went in and found where they had been deleting things on the back end. And again, caught them red-handed, like just full-blown corruption, right? Just full-blown deleting work orders. Oh, because I forgot to tell you that they get money, they get benefits, they get perks if they meet certain housing criteria. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about like the on-base mold and all that, just Google it. Be like, toxic military housing. There's countless stories. And I'll go into the history of how this happened and what land grants were done and what policies were put into place back at this all goes back to the war years when the military had aging infrastructure and they were like, what are we going to do? We're going to war and we can't house all these people that we need to bring in to, fight this war. And so they started selling off old military buildings and housing to private providers or private housing companies. There's about 5 of them. And the end of that story is it was really great and awesome for a hot second until those housing providers realized that they could just do these pump and dump schemes where they could let these properties go to shambles, get sued enough for making people sick or having inhospitable housing, and then sell off their assets, create a shell company, and then go start their Ponzi scheme again somewhere else. It's happening in mass. And I'm really hoping that at some point a toxic tort reform lawyer will take this. Michael Baum, I think you're aware of what's going on. Grant Savoy, you know what's going on. And anybody else who's, Ryan Reed is big in this space. And then there needs to be massive toxic tort reform. And there's actually other protections that taxpayers have, which is how we started this whole episode. Today is tax day, so go pay your taxes. If you're watching this at a later date, sorry. It's kind of ironic. I had to pay taxes today. It was the first time I've ever owed taxes and love paying my taxes. I genuinely do, because I believe that taxes are what help us, have a thriving economy and a productive society. But I'm also a hard worker and I want to know that my tax dollars are going to the people, places, and services that they're needed most. And on-base housing, to go back to, I don't even know, episode 2 or 3, where I talked about Oscar Ordonez, the housing chief, who said to me, well, you're wasting your time. You got to go FOIA this stuff. And I was like, you know what? I think I will, because I'm a tax-paying citizen. And at the end of the day, it's actually my taxes that are paying your salary, and my taxes are paying for this housing as well, because military housing is not free. You get a stipend for it, a basic housing allowance, but it's not free. It comes out of our taxes, comes out of your taxes. So this is why people should care, because military members and their families, I'm sorry, are living in toxic housing paid for by your tax dollars. All right, choking on my own toxicity. We're going to clap it there. Thank you for tuning into the Trebuchet. If you're suffering from domestic violence or know somebody who is, check out these resources below, and more links on toxic housing. And until next time, be well.